It's great to see so many people out here to come and learn about things about the brain. This is the first lecture in a series of 4 that will be well, today and the next couple of weeks on Tuesday as well. And the general theme is how to build your own cognition. And the reason for this theme is that it's the 20th anniversary of the Department of Artificial Intelligence in Groningen, and that's why we, on the one hand, want to celebrate that, but on the other hand, we want to think about a new theme of research that we're going to do. And that theme is what we call continuous cognition, that building systems is not a system for one thing, but it's also a thing for your whole life, that if you build a system, it has to persist in time. If you have a robot that starts doing things, you don't want to switch it off at the end of the day. It has to do things, it has to continue learning, and that is what we want to explore. And to do that, we have we've looked up a couple of experts on various of these topics. And you might think artificial intelligence is all about computers, but we are also interested in human intelligence, and that is why we start with the brain. And someone who's already doing brain building is our first guest speaker of today, which is Chris Eliasmith over there. And Chris is he's a professor and professor at the University of Waterloo and the director of the Center of Theoretical Neuroscience. But he has a background in many different things. He has a background in philosophy, in computer science, and in engineering. So he has done many different things already, and that is really great because this is really a multidisciplinary enterprise, and it will be great to hear him. Well, what Chris has been doing is he's been building models of the brain, and not just of small parts of the brain, but well, at least parts of the brain that encompass a whole cycle of perceiving things, thinking about things, and acting upon the world. And it's built all out of simulated neurons. And it's such a great achievement that he had a great publication in the Science Journal last year, and also made it into several television programs and in the news all over the world. So he will talk for approximately an hour, and after that we have half an hour or up to half an hour for questions. So hold on to your questions by the end. We have ample time to have them. So without further ado, I would like to introduce to you Chris Eliasmith.
So thank you, Niels. It's really great to be here in this beautiful city. And I have to say that, here, I'll see if I can pronounce it. I'm only going to try this once. Groningen. Is that close? I didn't have enough, I'm sure, but in this beautiful city, because actually yesterday I got to do something which I have never done before, and you can only do it in this city, and it's probably something that most of you have also never done. So I'm going to share this with you, and it has nothing to do with my talk, but I'm so excited about it, I wanted to share it. So I went to the Martini Tower yesterday, and I walked up the tower and back down, and that wasn't it, because you can walk up and down towers all over the place. But when I got to the bottom of the tower, there was a door open. It was because the tower was about to close, and so there was a gentleman in there who was, about to get everyone out of the tower. And when I poked my head in the door, I saw this rope going up and down like this. And I asked him, I said, "What's that?" He's like, "That's the bell rope." And he said, "Do you want to try it?" So, for sure, I want to try it. So I got to grab the bell rope and pull as hard as I could. It actually took a lot of effort, but when the rope touched the ground, you could hear the bell going off 100 meters high. That was pretty cool. And then he said, if you hold on to the rope, it will lift you off the ground, right? So there you are. It was really dark, so I'm pretty blurry, but that's me riding the bell rope. Pretty cool, eh? All right, so that was my highlight. Yes, thank you. I'm done now. So that has nothing to do with my talk, but I just had to share it because, that's definitely one off the bucket list, right? Being a bellboy, literally. All right, so I don't know how much of a chance you had to look at this model. So this is the model of the brain that Niels so kindly mentioned. And it's currently the world's largest functional brain model. And it has 2.5 million neurons in it. So each of these neurons are simulated individually. And the interesting thing about it, I don't know if you can tell what it's doing as you watch it. It's actually doing several different things. Does anybody have any guesses about the kinds of things that it's doing? Maybe? It's recognizing, yeah, so it's recognizing the digits that it's being shown here, And then sometimes it's processing them, finding patterns and stuff. But anyways, it doesn't really matter. The important thing, in a way, is that it's doing something, right? So hopefully you can get that from just looking at this picture. And what's important about this is that I think constructing this kind of model is actually a way of expressing our understanding about how the brain works, right? So it can be very difficult to keep in your head all the different kinds of interactions that there can be between 2.5 million neurons. So you can imagine that in one way, the only way that we can efficiently express our understanding of how the brain works is by building models like this. And so in some ways, this movie that I'm showing you is just kind of the tip of an iceberg, right? And what I want to do in the lecture today is sort of explore the rest of the iceberg and give you a sense of some of the knowledge that goes into trying to construct a model like this. So, I don't think we're there yet as far as understanding how the brain works, right? But I'm going to argue today that building this kind of model is, I think, the right direction to try to get to understanding how the brain works. So, as I mentioned, we don't know how the brain works. But imagine if we did, right? Why are we pursuing this kind of research? So if we understood how the brain worked, we could help the millions of Dutch people who suffer from mental diseases, and that would save the country upward of $19 billion, or euros, rather, a year. So I know those figures are right, because I looked them up this afternoon. We could also do things like test new kinds of drugs or new direct brain stimulation techniques while harming far fewer humans and other animals. We could take what we learned from how the brain works and begin to construct new kinds of machines. So to help us with everything from the complex to the mundane. So you can imagine having a robot that did your chores for you, or a web assistant that could actually help you research a difficult problem. And most of all, I think building these kinds of models is just really cool. It might even change how we think about who we are. But how are we going to do this? How are we going to build models of what is one of the most complex physical systems in the known universe? So there are over 80 billion neurons in a human brain. There are a quadrillion connections, really big numbers. But it's only 3 pounds, and nevertheless, it's more powerful than the most powerful supercomputers we have, while using only 20 watts of power. So it's an incredibly efficient computer. So how are we going to build something like this? Well, in fact, I think physicist Richard Feynman had a suggestion for us. He said, well, actually, so to give you some context, after he died, he had a blackboard, so he didn't say this, obviously, right? So there was a blackboard in his office that people looked at after he had died, and on the very top of the blackboard was written the following. It said, "What I cannot create, I do not understand." So the idea is that we express our understanding by the kinds of things that we can actually construct. So in the case of a brain, right, we want to build models of the brain. And so I want to give you some background on the ways that people have tried to build models of the brain in the past. So here are 3 standard approaches to building models of the brain or the mind. I will use those words happily interchangeably. So the first one relies on a metaphor which many of you might be familiar with, and this is thinking of the brain or the mind as a kind of computer. Right? So if we want to understand how the mind works, we often look to what are our most sophisticated technologies of the day. And this has actually been true for the last several hundred years. So people used to compare brains to telephone switching offices, or they would compare brains to sophisticated hydraulics. With the invention of the computer, we now compare the brain a lot of the time to the computer. And so the way that people would build models of the brain when thinking about it as a kind of computer is to write essentially computer programs, where we would think that the mind essentially had a set of rules in it, that these rules would express relationships between inputs and outputs, and that in order to explain the chain of reasoning that we sort of know we go through when we introspect, we'd be able to take a bunch of these rules and apply them to solve some kind of difficult problem. And in many instances, this was a huge success, trying to explain things like how people do some aspects of chess, or being able to build successful chess-playing programs, being able to build programs that could solve logic problems in the same ways that people solve logic problems was done very effectively using this sort of approach. But then there were other classes of problems which it was really bad at. So for instance, recognizing a face in a complex and cluttered scene is something that we just don't know how to write the rules down for. And for this reason, so this view sort of became popular in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and it's continued to be used now. But in the 70s and 80s, another view came into prominence, and this is often called Connectionism. And here, instead of thinking of the mind as a sort of digital computer of the kind you find on your desktop, they were thinking of the mind as a collection of simple nodes which are connected in very complicated ways. So in essence, it's sort of thinking of the mind as being like the brain. because we know in the brain we have a lot of neurons and they're connected in very complicated ways. So if we abstract that and just say we have nodes that do some simple computation and connect them in very complicated ways, we can show that they can compute quite interesting functions. In fact, it's exactly the kind of functions that were very difficult to compute in a symbolic approach. So one of the more famous early examples was you would take people and you'd build these sort of connectionist models where the input that you would give them was a sonar reading. So this would be a reading that you'd get off of a ship which was sailing through the waters. And then you would try to get the model or the person to tell the difference between a rock or a mine. And of course, if you're in the Navy, this is a very important difference. If you're in any boat, this is an important difference. Because you want to avoid the mines and the rocks, but less so the rocks than the mines. All right, so you know the problem. And what you could show is that by building these sorts of networks, you could actually get something that would do as well as humans in distinguishing between rocks and mines based on this kind of sonar signal. And this is exactly the kind of problem that we just don't know how to write down the rules for. Right, so here was a clear case where this new approach at the time was able to solve kinds of problems that the original, what often is called the classical approach or symbolic approach, wasn't able to solve. However, if you tried to get these sorts of models to do things that symbolicism was good at, like logical reasoning problems, right, or being able to play chess, then they fell down. So you saw strengths where you saw weaknesses in both of these areas. In the 1990s, there was a third view that came up, which is sometimes called dynamicism. And this was essentially a criticism of both connectionism and symbolicism. And the criticism came from sort of taking a step back and looking at what a cognitive system really was. And they argued that cognitive systems are essentially physical systems. So these are physical systems which are embedded in a particular environment. And for that reason, because of things like evolutionary pressure, the way that that system evolves over time is absolutely critical. That is, if I throw a baseball at you and you catch it, you've been successful. If you are doing exactly the same computations, but you're doing them at half the speed, you will never catch the ball and hence won't be successful. Or in a more evolutionary context, if you take a really long time to determine that it's a tiger that's coming at you, right, you won't succeed in sending your genes on to the next generation. And so they wanted to argue that both of these approaches, while being able to solve some interesting problems, essentially ignore time altogether. Right? So there's no particular speed at which computation has to happen. It just gets faster if you have a faster computer. There's also no particular speed at which these connectionist networks need to settle or be able to do their computations. And so the dynamicists preferred a metaphor. This is a picture of the weather, right? They preferred a metaphor of thinking of the mind as a kind of dynamical system, something which is intrinsically physical and has particular kinds of dynamics and is very complex and chaotic, perhaps kind of like the weather. And so they were able to explain certain kinds of behaviors very effectively, in particular motor behaviors. So the way that babies walk is very tied to exactly the sort of mass that they have in their legs, the kind of forces that they receive when they're contacting a surface. All these things play an important role in determining how babies actually move. And taking this dynamical view was a very effective way of capturing that kind of behavior. Now, unfortunately, they also ran into some problems like how do you do things like categorization, problems which connectionists were good at, or how do you do language understanding when you're trying to model something at this very low level. Okay, so these are sort of three approaches to building a mind, but I want to actually talk today about another approach. Because in a sense, none of these directly talk about the physics of the actual system we're trying to model. That is, the physics of neurons, right? How do neurons actually function? What equations can we write down to describe how voltages flow through a particular cell and so on, right? To actually talk about the biophysics. Dynamicism seems to sort of come close, but if you actually look at the models they build, they use parameters which are not actually parameters you find in the brain, right? They're parameters that are about things like motivation or the state of your leg, right? Not actually how neurons are functioning. So I'm really going to be spending the rest of my time trying to suggest to you that we essentially are now developing new mathematical theories that are allowing us to build these models at the level of biophysics and then begin to scale them up to a point where we can actually address cognitive function. So the idea is try to combine a lot of the insights that came from those past three perspectives while treating the system that we're interested in modeling as the physical system that we know that it is. And this lets us begin to build simulations at a level of detail that people haven't built in the past, and that was sort of what we saw a little bit of at the beginning in that model. And so it really lets us try to get at this issue of how do we take thousands or millions of neurons and connect them in order to actually do a function of some kind, and hopefully eventually do some kind of cognitive function. So in order to give you a sense of why that's a challenge, I want to basically give you some details about the brain, right? So just a few, but I think they're important ones. So what I'm showing here is a picture of some neurons. So there are 3 neurons in this picture, colored in green. There are a bunch of other cells in the background, which actually outnumber neurons in the cortex, but I'm going to ignore them, like all of the other neuroscientists, because that just makes your job even more difficult, right? So hopefully that comment will make you realize that any model that you see is going to be ignoring some things and picking others. So I will just give you one really clear example of the kinds of things I'm ignoring. So there's a whole population of cells, but everyone ignores it, so it's okay. So what we're going to focus on here is communication between neurons, right? So let's begin by looking at this top neuron here. So this sort of bulbous part is called the cell body. And most neural cells are a lot like all the other cells that you find in your body. So they have the same sort of metabolic processes and so on. What is unique about neurons, when you look at them, actually, is all of these branches that come out of them. So unlike a liver cell, for instance, you've got all kinds of long processes. And most of these processes, there's more cell bodies, right? We don't really care. Most of those processes are actually carrying information into the cell body. And these are all called dendrites. And this is basically where information from other neurons has impacted this particular cell, and that information in the form of a current is flowing into the cell body here. And if that current is sufficiently high, then essentially this cell body makes a decision that it's time for it to send a message to whoever it's connected to. So then you will see coming out just one special process, which is called an axon, which is the process that it sends its information down. And, So the way that the information flows is in the form of what are very brief action potentials. So this is a rapid change in voltage, and I'll refer to those as spikes. So you basically get some kind of pattern of spikes. So if this voltage or current goes high enough, then the cell will generate a spike. That spike will flow down this axon until it gets to the next neuron's dendrite. And the location where the axon touches the next neuron's dendrite is called a synapse. And what actually happens is that voltage turns into a neurotransmitter chemical, right? So it shows up as an electrical pulse. That electrical pulse causes the release of a chemical, the chemicals that we call neurotransmitters. Those then go across a really small gap, and they hit this dendrite of the next cell. And in virtue of those chemicals showing up at that cell, they cause another current to be generated. And then that current flows down to the next neuron. This is called a postsynaptic current, because it's a current that's being generated after the synapse. And then you have another neuron. It's collecting all of its dendritic inputs, and the process continues, right? And then it will send information. So this is sort of, obviously a cartoon version. These particular cells are real cells. You find them in the hippocampus. But this way of transmitting information is very common throughout a lot of cortex and in all mammals. However, having given you the cartoon version, I think it's important to let you know that this is definitely a cartoon version. So when you begin to look at neurons in different parts of the brain, you find that there are hundreds of kinds, maybe thousands, depending exactly how you count. And by kinds of cell, I mean that the sort of structure of those dendritic trees can often be quite different. The way that the axon projects out can be quite different. The physiology of the neuron can be different. That means that the way that it responds to voltages and currents can actually change depending on which cell you're looking at. And the way we know this is because we can actually inject the current right into the cell body, and we can see different patterns of spikes come out. And so we know for the same current, we get different spikes across lots of different neurons. And when we begin to look at how many different kinds there are many, many different kinds. And this makes it clear that neurons are highly heterogeneous, right? We have lots of different kinds of neurons in the brain. They vary enormously in size. So there are tiny microscopic neurons, which probably many of you think of. But there are also neurons that range up to 5 meters in length. Can anyone guess where you would find a 5-meter neuron? Yeah, not in humans. Yeah, but that's right. It's down the back of a giraffe, right? So it's the neuron that goes like from its brain all the way down its neck, all the way down its back, right, to get sensations out of the legs. And you can also find these enormous kinds of neurons in whales, right? So they can get very big. But yeah, even in humans, you find neurons that are up to 1 meter in length or more. The number of connections that you find on neurons varies a lot. So in the retina, you are on the order of 500 connections per neuron. In part of the brain called the cerebellum, which is very important for things like balance, you find upwards of 200,000 inputs and outputs for every single cell. On average, in the cortex, you find about 10,000 inputs and outputs. So if you want to impress your friends, that's where the quadrillion comes from. Quadrillions of connections, you can say, every one of my neurons has 10,000 inputs and outputs. So that gives you a sense of like what the components are that we have to deal with and the heterogeneity of the components, right? But of course, we don't want to just build models of components. This is something that, in fact, people have been doing for many years and we have actually quite good models of. But we want to be able to put all those components together. So as many of you may know, your brain looks kind of like this. Right? It's got all these wrinkles in it. But in fact, it's a sheet. So if you take that and flatten it out, you get a big sheet, and it's about the size of 4 pieces of paper. Probably even A4 paper. It's not that different in size from 8.5 by 11. And the reason it's all wrinkled like this, basically, is because it had to fit into a skull, right? And so nature's solution is crush it down and make it fit in that small area. If you look at other animals like mice and monkeys, a mouse is about a Post-it note size brain, a monkey is about 1 piece of paper. So one of the very special things about humans is precisely how big their cortex is. And in that cortex, we find 80 billion neurons, as I mentioned before. I think that's a really difficult number to have any sense of. So here's a more reasonable number, is if you drill down through 1 square millimeter of cortex and count the neurons, you'll find about 150,000 neurons in a square millimeter. So that's a much more manageable number. So we like to pay attention to that more. If you look at the number of wires, I told you there are like 10,000 inputs and outputs. If you laid all the wires, the dendrites and axons end to end, you'd have about 72 kilometers of fiber that have been put in your brain. This tells you something important, right? This tells you that communication is absolutely essential. In fact, the amount of volume in your brain dedicated to communication is about equal to the amount of volume that's dedicated to processing, right? And that tells you something about the system that you're going to be building. And lastly, I mentioned that when a spike comes to a synapse, it turns into a chemical, and that chemical is called a neurotransmitter. And if you look, there are actually hundreds of kinds of neurotransmitters. And this is important because it means that when a neuron spikes and it sends that output, right, it's going to 10,000 neurons. Some of those neurons might treat that spike in one way with one kind of neurotransmitter, and some neurons might treat it in a different way, even though it's the same spike in some sense, because they're using a different kind of neurotransmitter. So again, you have to be very wary of not only the heterogeneity of these individual components, but the many different ways in which they can be wired together. So looking at this kind of complexity, I always am boggled that nature was able to assemble such a thing. And I think the sort of final humbling factor is to keep in mind that the amount of energy used to run this machine, as I mentioned before, is only about 20 watts. And so I think the light bulb that shows up should really be a compact fluorescent light bulb. Right? Those other incandescent bulbs were using like hundreds of watts. If you look at your computer, it's using 100 to 500 watts, depending on how big a machine you have. So the fact that we can, or not we, that nature has built a machine that's able to outperform us computationally while using so much less power makes us realize that really there's probably some different computation is being treated in a different way. Right? The physics is different than it is for our digital machines. So one of the amazing things about science right now is that we can actually begin to image these 80 billion neurons doing things. And so just to give you a sense of what your brain looks like when it's doing something, this is some Fmri data which is being collected from somebody doing something. I don't know if anybody can guess what's going on. We can sort of see some activity back here, which means that the visual system sort of looks like it's active, but we also see some activity here in the frontal areas, so we might think that there may be working memories involved, there's some sort of cognitive task going on. So as we look at this, it's interesting to get a sense that this is one way of imagining what those 80 billion neurons are doing altogether. Does anybody have a guess about what this is? I don't know if there's any scientists who can recognize this data. So this brain is doing nothing. So this is called a resting state network, which this is what happens if you get somebody to sit in an fMRI machine and tell them not to do anything, right? And you still see all this activity, right? So one thing I always like to highlight is notice that more than 10% of your brain is active when you're doing nothing, right? So there's one myth that hopefully you will never repeat to your friends, that we only use 10% of our brain. All right, so in any case, right, this also tells us that there's always things that are going on, right? Even when we're not stimulating the brain or we're not doing things to it, something is going on there. And that's, you know, really why we're trying to model this sort of data. But it should also make us realize that, you know, no matter how long we stare at that data, we really don't know how you go from neurons to generating that sort of picture of these waves of activity moving through the brain. And so for this reason, I think, you know, data is really important, but I also believe that what we're really trying to do is build mechanisms that actually get at the sort of causal properties of brains, right? Like how does one neuron cause the next neuron to fire? And how does that neuron cause all of its next neurons to fire? And how do they do that in such a way that it's actually generating this sort of behavior, right? So we want like a, you know, cogs in the machine sort of explanation. And in order to do that, in order to address sort of this deeper problem of like how the brain actually works, rather than just sort of observing it work, I think we need to turn to a different way of addressing the function of the brain, and that is to build models of the kind that I'm going to present to you shortly. And in fact, I'm not the only one who thinks this, right? So I mentioned Richard Feynman thought this was a good idea, but if you actually just look across theoretical neuroscience, you see that that's essentially the entire purpose of a lot of people in that field. So theoretical neuroscience might not be a very familiar field to many of you, but what the field is essentially invested in is building mathematical models that describe how these small networks can give rise to some of the kinds of data that we record. But you know, because theoretical neuroscience is typically not something that anyone's heard of, how many people have heard of theoretical neuroscience? A couple, yeah, so a few, very small proportion. How many people have heard of theoretical physics? Like everybody, right? So I thought it would be useful for me to compare theoretical neuroscience to theoretical physics, just to give you a sense of what the sort of point of this field is. All right, so here's my little analogy. So the first thing we want to do is we want to quantify the phenomena of study, right? So in the case of theoretical physics, one of the phenomena that they study is the motion of physical objects, right? So Newton had a really nice rule, F equals ma, and so this is his way of quantifying a whole slew of different kinds of movement, right? So this is true for linear motion, it's true for cyclic motion, it's true for all kinds of things. And so in theoretical neuroscience, we might want to do the same kind of thing, right? Write down an equation like this, where, you know, it doesn't really matter if I tell you what the variables mean. The whole point is that we're writing equations down to express what the phenomena are. So in this case, this means that the sort of represented state in the brain is equal to a bunch of activities across a bunch of neurons times some decoder. Okay, so this is just in the same way that the force is going to be equal to the mass times the acceleration. So if you know some of these things, you can predict others and so on, right? So that it's a way of trying to express our ideas about how the system is working very precisely. And when you do that, one of the things that often happens is you can summarize lots of data, right? So in the case of F equals ma, you know, that one little equation summarized the motion of a lot of objects, right? Very, very precisely. And we'd like the same to be true of this equation, so maybe this is a way of expressing the neural representation of information, regardless of whether it's visual information or auditory information or what have you, right? So that's why we want to express our ideas in this sort of precise way. Next, we should also notice that theoretical physics is highly speculative, right? So when Newton wrote this equation down, he took it to be true for every velocity that you'd ever encounter, right? Now, eventually we found out that he was wrong, that when you begin to get close to the speed of light, that this equation actually breaks down and you need a different equation, right? But nevertheless, you know, at the time, he thought this would be the right equation. And similarly, you know, we will say for now that we think this is true for all the different kinds of stimuli that you might want to show to a system, right? So if you show it, then we're hoping that this equation is going to be satisfied. Of course, the only way we'll find out that it isn't is testing lots of different circumstances. Just like we found out that this was wrong by making a lot of observations and to determine that was wrong. So, you know, overall, we can see a lot of similarities between theoretical physics and theoretical neuroscience. The main difference being, of course, that theoretical physics is telling us about the physical universe, and theoretical neuroscience is trying to tell us about who we are, right? Trying to let us understand sort of our inner universe, if you will. So the method is the same insofar as we use lots of equations, and we use a lot of simulation, typically more simulation in the case of theoretical neuroscience, but a lot of physics is now actually doing simulations. And if you think about how important theoretical physics has been for physics, right? So you have people like Einstein and Newton, and the list goes on, household names, because they were actually able to really change the state of the science. And my suspicion is that given the sort of rapid increase in the number of sort of theoretical institutes and people going into theoretical neuroscience, that I think ultimately we are going to see that same kind of impact had by theoretical neuroscience on the way that neuroscience is done. And I'm not the only person who thinks that. So in fact, in the European Union alone, there was a recent project which was funded to the tune of €1 billion, which you might have heard of, called the Human Brain Project. And in the United States, they also, 2 months after the EU announced their project, announced their own project, right, which was putting $1 billion into doing brain research. And both of these have a main component of theory. So with that in mind, I want to give you a sense of what the state of the art is in large-scale brain models, right? So this is sort of the state of the art for theoretical neuroscience looking at big models. So the first project I'm going to tell you about is an American project, which is often called the Synapse Project. It's part of the IBM Cognitive Computing Lab. And the head of the project is named Dharmendra Mota. And originally, about 2 years ago, they simulated 1 billion neurons. And so this is a lot of neurons. They're sort of simple spiking neurons. So they're simulating a lot of the properties of single cells. So they generate their spikes. They have currents in them. They're connected to one another in reasonable kinds of ways. And in fact, about a year later, they announced that they could simulate 500 billion neurons, which is a big number, right? That's 5 times more than there are in your brain. So maybe too big a number. All right, so when they made this announcement, this original 1 billion neuron announcement, Mota presented a slide that looked exactly like this. He said, here's our model, right? So it's not the size of a human brain. It's covering a big chunk of cortex. But it is at the scale of a cat, right? So now we're building brain models at the scale of a cat. That's great. In fact, when he was evaluating his own research, he said it was a tremendous historic milestone. But not everyone agreed with him. So Henry Markram said that it was a hoax and a PR stunt. So who's this Henry Markram guy? Well, he went on to say it's highly unethical of Mota to mislead the public in making people believe that they have actually simulated a cat's brain. It's absolutely shocking. And in fact, this is a very entertaining public letter that Markram wrote and distributed to a whole bunch of science journalists and sent it to the head of IBM and shared it with all of his colleagues. And it was entertaining because you really don't often see this sort of vehement of criticism of another person's work in your own field. So why was he saying these kinds of things? Well, you may have guessed it's because he actually had a model of his own. So it was called the Blue Brain Project at the time, but now it's the centerpiece of this, what? You can delete one of those brains, of the Human Brain Project. And sort of ironically, he's running his computer program on the same machine. But for him, he has 1 million realistic neurons, right? So one reason he got very upset is because they had more neurons than him. And the reason that he figured it was worth getting upset is because his neurons were realistic, whereas those other neurons were simple. Now, I've done him a favor and put realistic in quotes here, right? Because, as presumably you could appreciate from just looking at that one slide where I pointed out all the cells that we were ignoring, any model has to make some kinds of simplifications and assumptions. And so he's made different simplifications and assumptions, but it doesn't mean that his neurons are realistic in the sense that they reproduce all of the things that we can measure from an actual neuron. So it is true that it's more complicated. So for their neurons, they would use about 100 equations per cell, whereas in Mota's model, they only had about 2 equations per cell. So definitely much more complicated. But it raised this sort of approach to trying to build a brain raises a real concern. And the problem is that it basically focuses on how single cells work, right? So they put a lot of their computational power into modeling an individual neuron. And the reason they did this is because they're on record for saying that if they wanted to understand intelligence, they just needed to do this a lot of times over, and intelligence was going to emerge. Right? So if we build really complicated individual neurons, and then we put a lot of them together, then the rest of it, right? So all of the behavior and stuff is just going to come out of whatever we do. And so hopefully you agree with me that this is really a problem, right? And it's a deeper problem than just pointing out how many equations somebody used in their particular neuron model. And it's a deeper problem because what you're doing is you're building one of these, right? You're building a brain in a jar. So if we take the purpose of neuroscience to be telling us why there's all this complex activity in the brain and how it relates to all the complex behavior that we see, then you've essentially left out half of the story, right? So we've clearly got some very complex simulations, right? We've got 100 equations per cell, we've got 1 million cells, we can simulate them, and then we can look at the pattern of activity and we can look at the voltages inside that model, but they bear absolutely no relation to behavior, to performance, to doing something, right? And if you think of the brain as a controller of behavior, then you've missed the point, essentially. And so sort of to drive this point home, I'm going to tell you a story that is going to highlight this problem, right? The problem of saying, oh, we're just going to scale it up. So this is what Henry Markham is basically on record as saying is, well, right now we only have 1 million neurons, but if you give me 1 billion euros, then we'll have 80 million neurons and intelligence will emerge. But I don't think this is true, and I don't think it's true because of elephants. And because of this particular elephant. Yes, that was a non sequitur. So this elephant, his name was Tusco. Actually, it's not, this is just a web image that's standing in for Tusco, because Tusco lived in the 1960s. And Tusco was an elephant that a group headed by Lewis West were studying, and they were really interested in a particular behavior that these elephants exhibit. And in particular, it's a behavior exhibited by adolescent male elephants, and it's called musth, which is M-U-S-T-H. And it's an aggressive behavior where the adolescent males get very sort of angry and irritated and begin to do all kinds of crazy things. And so they wanted to understand why that happened. And the problem was that you couldn't just sort of wait for it to happen because it wasn't that common. So they wanted to figure out a way to induce this behavior in these elephants. And I'll remind you, it was the 1960s. So can anybody guess how they figured they would get an elephant to exhibit this aggressive, strange behavior? Was that? LSD. LSD. There you go. Some people guessed right away. We won't ask them any personal questions. So, right. It's the 1960s, right? And you want to get some strange behavior out of the animal you're studying, so you drug it with LSD. Now you have a problem, right? And the problem is that nobody has given LSD to an elephant before. And so this is a scaling problem, right? And so you can see the analogy to Markham's model. So we have to scale up LSD dosage to figure out how much to give to an elephant. So, of course, again, being the 1960s, they had given LSD to lots of other animals, right? So humans and monkeys and cats were all, filled with LSD many times over. So they had a baseline, right? But then they had to scale, right? So the question is, how do you scale? Well, Lewis West and his colleagues came up with a solution to this problem. They said, all right, we know how much a cat weighs, and we know how much an elephant weighs. So we can divide the weight of an elephant by the weight of a cat, and we get a really big number. And then we know how much LSD we can give to a cat, right? And so we multiply that by this really big number, and we get a huge dose of LSD. And then, of course, they had to give it to the elephant. And actually, I don't know how they gave it to the elephant, but I always imagine them like having a big syringe and sneaking up behind the elephant, and, right? Or maybe a newspaper and just slathering it on and throwing it on his tongue or something. I don't know. So they gave this huge amount of LSD to the elephant, Tusco, and warn you that there's a sad ending to this story. So Tusco trumpeted loudly and ran around, so sort of started acting crazy, but very quickly fell over. And after about 20 minutes, he just stopped breathing altogether, and he died. So yes, this is a sad story. But it's going to serve my purposes today because they obviously made some decisions about how to scale, right? And the point is that when you say just scale up, it's really not easy to make those decisions. So for instance, instead of picking a cat as the baseline, right, they could have picked a human. And if they picked a human instead, they would have given it 30 times less LSD. Okay, so you have to pick a baseline that is relevant for your scaling problem. And that's not necessarily an obvious and easy thing to do. They also have to pick sort of a dimension along which to scale, right? So they picked mass, right? But you could also have picked metabolism. And if they would have picked metabolism and compared cat metabolism to elephant metabolism, they would have given it 60 times less LSD than what they gave it. You also could have picked brain size, which in retrospect seems like the obvious choice. If they would have done that, they would have given it 300 times less LSD, right? So this elephant was massively overdosed. So poor Tusco. I'm not convinced that Lewis West and his colleagues thought that this was a failed experiment because they actually got a publication in Science, in that illustrious journal. But anyways, I'm sure Tusco felt that it was a failure of an experiment. And the point that I want to make here, of course, is that when you say something like just scale up, it's definitely not obvious what your baseline should be and how you're going to scale up. So, for instance, picking a baseline of a cortical column or a particular part of the hippocampus, which has been picked by the Human Brain Project, and then choosing the number of neurons as the dimension along which you're scaling are not obviously the right ways to go when you're trying to scale something up. So the moral of the story essentially is that when we build models, right, they might actually suffer the same fate as poor Tusco if we just scale them up in sort of uninformed ways, right? And the models might just die some horrible death in a much less literal way than what poor Tusco did. And you can, another way of thinking about the same thing is you can think about your cell phone, right? If you took your cell phone and you took all of the transistors in your cell phone and you put them in a big pile, they wouldn't do much, right? They would just be a pile of transistors. If you measured all the connections between the transistors in a small part of your cell phone and you looked at the statistics of that connection and then generated new little parts by sampling from that statistical distribution and connecting a bunch of stuff up, and then did that over and over and over and over again, so people who know about the Human Brain Project know that that's what I just described, your cell phone also won't work, right? It won't be doing anything. So it really matters for you to look at how the transistors are organized in a particular part of the cell phone, what information is going to that part of the cell phone and coming out of that part of the cell phone, in order for you to actually get a sense of what the functions of the system are and give you an idea about how you can begin to build something that has a similar kind of function. So, obviously I've been telling you all these things for a reason. The reason being to sort of set up the impetus or the ideas that were behind this model that we published last year, or just over a year ago, I suppose. So this model is called SPAWN for short, but that stands for Semantic Pointer Architecture Unified Network. As I've mentioned, it had 2.5 million neurons. And importantly, right, those neurons are not randomly connected or connected in some sort of statistically similar way, but they're connected in such a way that the model actually does things, right? In particular, it can do 8 different tasks. So I want to give you some demonstrations of those tasks, beginning with the basic perceptual task. So this is our brain model, which I've shown you before. So here what is happening is it's being shown a digit, and this is a handwritten digit, so you just take it from a database of human handwriting. And then when it's shown a question mark, it has to write out what it thinks the digit it just saw is. Right? So it saw a 2 and a question mark, so it drew a 2. And it sees another 2 and a question mark, so it draws a 2 again. Okay, and you can see that the input to the model is just an image, just like you might show a person, and the output from a model. So this is a physically modeled arm. It's got all these muscles and so on. And so this brain is telling these muscles how much to activate in order to move the arm in such a way as to draw its response. Okay, so the nice thing about this is we can take exactly the same inputs and outputs and get them from humans, right? So we can run the same tasks that we run on the model on humans. But of course, more than this, we can look at the brain activity. So this is sort of a very high-level view. But because this is a model, of course, we can actually look at every single spike from every single neuron in the model if we wanted. So here I'm just showing a sample of spikes coming out of a part of the visual cortex. On top of that, I'm drawing the picture that you see if we decode these spiking patterns. So if we were going to guess based just on the spiking pattern what image had been shown, it's plotted there. But we can do the same thing in other parts of the model. So here is where the model is actually remembering what it was shown. So you see this thing that it thought it was had just seen. And then here we can see the set of points that it's trying to move its arm through, right? And this is where it actually moves its arm through. And if you watch, you can see that those things are actually slightly different. Right, so we can begin to go and not only look at the behavior of the model, but also look at all of the sort of detailed mechanisms and the spikes. We can compare this data to the same data that you'd collect from a monkey, let's say, or a human performing this task. And we can also, compare how well it does the task. So in this particular task, the model gets about 94% correct, and humans get about 98% correct. So it's, close, but not great. But we can also do other kinds of tasks, right? So for instance, we can do a more cognitive task. So here's a challenge for you to solve this task on your own. So it's not a very complicated task you might think, but in fact it is a task that only humans can do. And the reason that only humans can do it is because to figure out what goes in this box, you're actually ignoring the fact that these are numbers, right? Being a number and the way that this number happens to look is not important for you, right? What's important for you that you figured out very quickly because you're a smart person is that there's one of the thing, and then two of the thing, and then three of the thing. Okay? And that's the kind of, just looking at the structure and noticing that it's the structure that matters for solving the task is something that every other animal than humans has a hard time with. And so here we can watch the model doing the same sort of thing. So you can see it's being presented with this sort of information. And I should mention that it's never seen this particular puzzle before. So it actually has to figure out what the relationship is between the numbers. It has to figure out the pattern in what it's being shown. And then when we get to the last square here, it's got a question mark, and it writes out its answer. Hopefully the same one that everybody here got. Okay, so one really important thing about doing these two particular tasks is that it's exactly the same brain model that is doing both tasks, right? So we didn't change the model in any way between tasks. And the reason is because what we're really interested in understanding is the flexibility of human cognition, right? So, a lot of sort of machine intelligence or AI is focused on building systems which do one thing really, really well, right? So play chess really, really well, right? Better than humans, or answer questions on Jeopardy or what have you. But one of the amazing things about human cognition is that we can go from playing a game of chess to playing a game of Jeopardy, to driving a car, to answering an email, to having a conversation, right? And we can do all these things without changing our brain in any significant ways. So there's got to be some mechanism inside of our brain that is really good at figuring out what the task is and how to solve different tasks, even though we're not changing the model or the brain, as it were. Right? So there's no changes between the task, and there's a bunch of other tasks that it can do as well. I'm not going to show all of these to you, but I'm going to give you sort of a quick overview of a few more in this next movie. So one thing you might ask is, well, how do you tell it which task to do? And if you watch, you actually see the letter A, which is going to tell it that the next digit is a task. So there's an A followed by a 1. So that tells it that the next thing it has to do is task 1. Right? Just like I would say to you, categorize this number. Or I might say to you, copy what this number looks like. And you will see in a moment here. Right now it's doing task. Oh, no, that was A1. Yeah, so A0 now. So this is a different task. And here when it sees a digit, it's actually trying to copy the style of that digit. And so you see it draws a 2 with a loopy bottom. And when we show it another 2 of a different style, right, it's now going to draw something with that style. So we can see that it doesn't only do categorization, but can actually be sensitive to sort of the details of what's going on. This next task here, I'm just going to pause the movie briefly to explain it. So this is what's called a reinforcement learning task. And it's patterned after a task that they run on rodents all the time. So the task on the rodent is you take a rat, you put it in a maze, or it's actually something they call a maze, which isn't at all like a maze. It's just a figure 8, basically. So you put the rodent in a maze. It runs to a point, a T junction, and it has to figure out if it should go left or right. And at the beginning of the task, it doesn't really know why. It just kind of goes one direction. And when it does that, it gets a reward, or it doesn't, with some probability. Right? So on the right side, it might be 70% probability. On the left side, it might be 10% probability. And so you let the rodent run through the maze, and after a while, right, it's smart, and it figures out that turning right is where it gets the most reward. And so it starts turning right all the time. And then, of course, being the evil scientist, you change the probability of reward. So you make this 10% now, and this is 70%, and the rodent will sort of do this for a while, but then get unimpressed and start exploring again, and eventually figure out that, oh, the reward's over here now, and it will start running the other direction. So in order to reproduce that behavior in our model, obviously it doesn't run through mazes, it draws numbers. So instead it draws the numbers 0, 1, or 2, and that's its way of basically choosing an action, like turn left or turn right. And then we will show it a number on the screen, and if we show it a 1, it means that it got reward, and if we show it a 0, it means it didn't get reward. And so then the idea is that we can watch how it solves this reinforcement learning task. So this is task number 2. So the first thing we say is make a choice. So it just draws a 1, that's just random, and it got a reward. So then we say, well, what do you want to do now? So it's drawing another 1, but it didn't get a reward. It draws another 1, it doesn't get a reward. So now it changes what it's doing. So it tries something else, no reward. Tries another action, and it starts to get a reward. And in fact, on this particular run, the 2 is the one that gets the most reward. And so it starts choosing a 2 a lot, and so it gets a lot of reward, and it keeps choosing the 2. But of course, then we'll switch the probability, and it will eventually figure out, oh yes, I have to choose a different number. Okay, so that's an important task to include because it's showing that the model can essentially change the way that it acts depending on information that it gets from the environment. This next task, which is sort of scrolling by while I'm talking, isn't that important. It's another cognitive task, kind of like the pattern of digits I showed you before, like the 1, 1, 1, 1, and so on. In this case, it's getting some input-output relation. So it was shown like 0094, 94, 0014, 14, 0024, 24. So it's given 3 examples. And then it's going to be shown something it hasn't seen and asked to complete the pattern. So in this case, it's 0074. And so when it sees a question mark, it fills that in presumably the same way that you would fill it in, right? By realizing that it's a repetition of the last 2 digits. So this last task here is a working memory task. So it's trying to remember this list of digits, just like you'd remember a telephone number. And we can actually watch as it begins to forget some of the information that it's been presented with, right? And so as it writes out its answer, when it gets to this number 8, it's going to draw a horizontal line, which means that it doesn't know what's there, right? But it will continue to complete the list. And the reason I put this task, making a mistake, in there is because I want to keep in mind that we're not trying to make a system which just does these tasks really well. We're trying to make a system which does these tasks the way that people do, right? So just like you, this model is better at remembering the beginning and the ends of lists more than the middle. And we can, in fact, compare the human data to the model data, and these lines are statistically indistinguishable. Unfortunately, they don't have error graphs on the human data. But this basically shows that you have the same kinds of errors being made at the same sorts of positions in the model and in the human data. And we can generate these predictions for any length of list. Similarly, and this shows us that we're getting something sort of important about the behavior right. And similarly, we can begin to look back at that reinforcement learning task. We can look at the pattern of spikes that are generated in a particular part of the model called the ventral striatum, which is particularly important for doing reinforcement learning. And we can look at rodents that were run on the same task. And we can compare the spike trains in exactly the way that the neuroscientists do, so filter our data the same way they do, and show that we actually get quite a nice match. So this lets us suspect that maybe we actually have some of the mechanisms that you find in the brain in our model. There are lots of other ways in which the model is brain-like. So we have a lot of areas, and we've named all of the areas after a particular anatomical area you find in the brain because it performs a similar function. Any of the connections that we have in the model are real connections that you find in the brain. So there's lots of connections in the brain, not in the model, right? But anything in the model, we make sure is in the brain. When you look across the model at the different kinds of neurotransmitters that are used, we make sure we use the same kinds of neurotransmitters in the model as you would find in that part of the brain. Similarly, right, we try to match the physiology of the individual neurons, and so on, right? So we're trying to do a lot of work to make sure that the model exhibits a lot of the properties that you find in the real human brain. And then importantly, we can get predictions about lots of different sorts of data that neuroscientists and psychologists collect. So the point of doing this is to try to express a view of cognition which essentially borrows from those 3 previous views that I described before, but tries to integrate them in a way where they're unified in virtue of being implemented in a particular physical substrate, right? The physical substrate of the brain. And so I wrote this book recently called How to Build a Brain. So this came out in the spring. And the idea is to try to express that view in detail and give lots of examples of its application. And in fact, that model that I showed is essentially chapter 7. Right? So I go through and say, here's how we build lots of parts, but if we want to put them all together, we can, and this is the sort of result that you might find. So, just like you would find in symbolicism, we show that this model can work well with structure, right? So it can do this kind of syntactic reasoning that only other humans can do, right? Other animals in the animal kingdom have a really hard time with. And so that was something that symbolicists were good at, but I think that these models also capture that kind of performance. With connectionists, they were very good at doing things like recognizing patterns in sonar, right? That is sort of more statistical kinds of reasoning. And we can show that, this model can recognize digits quite well, and that those digits are natural stimuli, right? They're handwritten digits that have all kinds of variability in them because people just wrote them down, right? And lastly, for this sort of dynamical view, we can compare the kinds of dynamics that we get out of our model to the measured brain dynamics, and we can show that they match quite well. And we're also doing things like controlling an arm, right? Actually controlling all the muscles in the arm in order to get the system to do something interesting. And so, returning to Richard Feynman's comment that what I cannot create, I do not understand, hopefully it's clear that we've really taken this idea on board, and that some of these new mathematical methods and theories that we've been developing begin to let us actually seriously address this problem from the perspective of sort of physically instantiating the models and being able to simulate the physics of the individual cells while still trying to address issues of how cognition happens. Now, with that sort of grandiose thing having been said, I want to definitely remind everybody that there's a really long way to go. So the model that I presented to you has 40,000 times fewer neurons than are in the brain. Of the 1,000 or more brain areas that we know about, this model has 20 of them. It only really knows how to process the digits from 0 to 9. It doesn't have a sort of general understanding of all kinds of semantics. It's missing a lot of important functions, so it doesn't really have a long-term memory, right? There's many other kinds of things that it just doesn't do. But nevertheless, I think that this sort of approach to building and hence understanding, right, if we take Feynman seriously, how the brain works, can help and will actually sort of begin to usher in a new way of characterizing brain function. And with that, I will stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Extremely interesting lecture. So there's now time for questions, and we have a microphone for that. So if you raise your hand, then the microphone will come to you to answer your question. So who can I give the floor to ask a question?
Hello. I wondered about the reward you give to your model of your brain. Why would it be interested in a reward? What's the mechanism there?
Right. Why is it interested in a reward? So, interestingly, people treat all kinds of weird things as reward, right? So, for instance, if you play a video game and you get points, that turns into a reward somehow. And the question is, how does that happen? And there's a lot of work that goes into trying to figure out how the reward system in the human brain works. But what we did in our case was essentially take something like a point, right? So when it's being shown a digit, it's obviously not intrinsically rewarding. But what we're assuming is that point, just as we know happens in the video game case, can generate the production of a particular kind of neurotransmitter called dopamine. And that, so we associate that number directly with dopamine, and the dopamine can act as a signal to tell the brain when it's been successful or hasn't been successful in performing whatever task it's trying to perform. And so, we don't completely understand exactly how that mapping happens in the brain, but we know that it does happen. And so in the model, we sort of built it straight in, but then we use that signal in the same way that we think brains use that signal to give an error information to a part of the brain called the striatum. And then the connections in the striatum change in order to try to minimize that error, right? And so this is a sort of standard way of understanding reinforcement learning, and one that we've sort of borrowed and put directly into the model. And that actually, last comment is, when I showed that comparison between the spike data in the rodent and the spike data coming out of the model, that is basically recording that system. So we can see that we actually get the, sort of spiking properties of part of the dopamine system correct too.
I saw you writing down some mathematical formulas, and we all know that mathematics have done a great deal in many areas of science. Then I saw you didn't continue that route and just go back to what you saw in the brains. Have you worked it out furthermore? Have you made lots of formulas around it?
Yes, so I figured this wouldn't be the place to show a lot of formulas. So, one way of thinking about that 2.5 million neuron model is that for every neuron we have 2 equations, and that you could write down all 5 million equations, and that would be a very efficient way of expressing the model. So, the way that we've actually gone about building this model is sort of in 2 stages. The first stage was coming up with general mathematical principles that would let you understand how any function could be computed using spiking neurons. And so, we've got explicit equations that describe what the relationship is between this high-level function and all the parameters in a spiking neural network in order to allow it to compute a particular function. So my first book focused on that, and it's highly mathematical, so not very many people read it. So my second book, so once we had done that, it would actually let us build some software, which now people who don't really understand the math can still sort of bring a bunch of neurons together and connect them to test out their ideas about how brains might function. And then this more recent book that I talked about kind of summarizes that work in 1 chapter and introduces that through use of the software, and then focuses more on, what are the functions that need to be computed in order to act like a brain, right? So the first thing was a lot of math about how you could compute arbitrary functions. The second one is, well, what are the functions that are relevant for actually understanding how brains work? So if you like math, I have an entire book that I can point you towards and has all the details in it. And if you don't, I have another book which you can avoid all the math and still come to understand how the brain models work. And I honestly think that taking these two perspectives is important for demonstrating that we understand what's going on.
Oh, yeah.
Did you use in your network principles of the Hopfield network?
No, we don't actually. So we do have several attractor networks in our model. And the Hopfield network is a kind of attractor network. But the Hopfield network makes some assumptions which are not very plausible. So it assumes that every neuron is connected to every other neuron. So you have all these bidirectional connections. And you often don't find that in the brain. So yeah, it's not really a sort of computational principle that we use a lot.
So you don't use an energy minimalization function?
Sure, yeah, we use lots of energy minimization, but you know, that's basically just a kind of optimization procedure. And so, in fact, that book I was talking about before, we propose a particular way of doing this minimization of particular error functions. So that's definitely a main part of it, but yeah, Hopfield again is sort of one specific example of doing such minimization.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm just wondering how you're going to expand on the brain, right? Are you going to think of more tasks and then add the modules, or you just add the modules and then see what tasks it can do?
Right, yeah, this is a very good question. So something that I sort of wasn't able to communicate in the brief time I had, but I think is very critical if you're actually building models, is that the way we construct this model is not by worrying about the tasks. What we do instead is we worry about the computations that need to be done. So if I show you a diagram, which I did this afternoon in my more technical talk, if I showed you a diagram of sort of the main functions that were being computed by the model, if you look at the labels of those, it's things like encode information, decode information, use reinforcement information, figure out a path, like do inductive reasoning, right? So these sort of working memory, right? So very high level important things to do. And then to do a particular task, what you need is a controller, which for us is the basal ganglia. And that controller then basically links these different boxes up in different ways depending on the task. So the boxes are all sitting in cortex, and then the basal ganglia figures out how to link them together to do a particular task. So what that means is that you can actually very efficiently add new tasks if they're exploiting exactly the same set of functional boxes, right? So if you look at that task that I showed that has like 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, so that's very similar to that other task that I showed that had 0, 0, 9, 4, 9, 4, so on and so forth. They're both reasoning over structure. And so the difference between those two tasks is on the order of like 200 or 300 neurons. It's almost nothing. And those neurons are all sitting in the basal ganglia because all they're doing is directing information in a slightly different way in order to solve the two different tasks. Now, that being said, right, if you went and you said, well, I want you to do a long-term memory task, I would say to you, I don't have any part of my brain that does that. Well, not my brain, but my brain model. So there's no part of my model that does that. And so I would have to go and build another whole box, right? That would be something like, you know, long-term memory acquisition, and basically would be a hippocampus, right? Which is part of the brain that's important for doing that kind of thing. And so that's really the kind of work that's going on in my lab mostly right now, right? So we're not that interested in using the boxes we already have to do additional tasks with those boxes, but we want to add boxes. So we want, you know, more functions to be sitting in the cortex, so it opens just up an entire like horizon of tasks that we'd never been able to do before.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thanks. There is a lot of energy going to the brain. We use a lot of oxygen. Where is all the energy going to, since it only uses 20 watts?
That's actually where it all goes. So the entire body is extremely efficient, right? So yeah, about 25% of the glucose sort of burned by the body is in the brain. So, you know, a quarter of the budget. So that makes you think that it's doing something really important, because it is, right? It's controlling everything. But it's also surprising in the sense that, you know, the brain isn't doing any actual physical work, right? So you don't technically need a lot of power if you're not doing physical work. Like, by physical work, I mean like taking something with mass and moving it somewhere else. That's what muscles do, right? But muscles are also incredibly efficient, right? So, you know, the other 60 watts that you're burning, right? So basically it means that the entire body is burning on the order of 80 watts or so, which is like amazing. But they're just also really efficient, right? So, you know, if you look through the numbers, they do all add up, and the entire thing is amazingly efficient. But the energy budget for the brain is actually quite high compared to the rest of the body.
You said your model had 20 of 1,000 parts of the brain.
20 out of 1,000, yeah.
Yeah. The other models, did they have that many, or did they even have parts? Because you said they were kind of simple. The first.
Yeah, they don't have parts, exactly.
Oh.
Yeah. So the so in the case of that 500 billion neuron model, essentially what they did is they took a particular neuron model and then they randomly connected it with some profile, some distance basically from it to its neighbors. Randomly connected it, and then I think they might have had a learning rule in it or something, and then just simulated it to see what happened. And so you get, you know, sort of waves of activity moving across the brain and stuff, but, you know, it's not really doing anything. And there's no anatomical structure, in a sense, that maps onto the kind of anatomical structure you find in the brain. And then in the other model, so that was the American model, and then the European model, essentially what they're doing is they believe that the brain can be divided up into something called a hypercolumn, where you find about 30,000 hypercolumns throughout the brain. And so they're trying to model one hypercolumn to start. And so they're saying, you know, there's about you know, some number of neurons in the hypercolumn, and we're going to model that. And so they're actually looking in a particular part of the brain called the hippocampus, where they're taking a lot of slices out of rodents and counting or looking at all the connections that you find in the slice, and then figuring out the statistics of connectivity between different cells, and then building a model which reflects those statistics, and then simulating at the moment sort of just under one hypercolumn. And so their idea is that if they get, you know, the hypercolumn right, then if they just reproduce that over and over and over again, then they'll be fine, right? So there's, I mean, in some ways it's a little bit difficult to explain, but there's a sort of an anatomical view of the brain where all you look at is, you know, just the connections between all the neurons. And when you do that, you can sometimes convince yourself, like I think you have to squint a little bit, but anyway, some people convince themselves that, you know, you've got this sort of repeated pattern through all of cortex, like this hypercolumn thing. Then another view of the brain is a functional view, where you say, you know, what are these neurons doing compared to those? And even though the anatomy looks the same, you know, these neurons might be more important for processing information about faces, and these neurons might be important for figuring out what task you're currently doing in the environment, right? So like two totally different things. Anatomically they can look the same, but functionally they can look quite different. And so when I said there are 1,000 identified brain areas, that's taking sort of a combination of an anatomical and functional view, where it, you know, depends both on the way things are connected, but also where it sits in the brain and the kind of information it tends to process. But yeah, sort of, that was a very long answer to your question, for which the answer is, yeah, no, they don't have any other structure.
What questions? Well, I still have one for you. Oh,
okay.
Cheers, can I have one?
Oh.
What is your brain doing when it's not doing anything? And with your brain, I mean your brain and your simulated brain.
Ah, I see. Good question. Because there's two questions there. You snuck them into one. All right, so my simulated brain, when there's no input, is sitting there waiting for input, right? And so I think that is actually much less interesting than what an actual brain is doing while it's sitting there. So nevertheless, you know, it's not doing nothing, right? So it is sitting there, and there are oscillations. You can make measurements that you can compare to the kinds of oscillations you find in a human resting brain. But I definitely think that it's not nearly as interesting, because in the human resting brain, we don't know exactly what's going on, right? So you can ask people to report what they were thinking about, and often it's, you know, what they had for lunch and what they're going to do tomorrow, and, you know, what things they have to do back at the office. And so basically their mind wanders. And if you look at the sort of structure of the activity, you find these sort of groups of brain areas that seem to sort of get active together for a little while, and then they sort of go quiescent, and another group of areas gets active. And so people have started identifying networks, and sometimes they seem functionally relevant. So, you know, a network, most of which is motor systems, will sort of be active and then go quiescent. And then you have another bunch of areas which are fairly perceptually related, seem to come up and go down, and so on. And so, you know, it's tough to say exactly what's going on. But my suspicion is that, you know, there's this intrinsically generated activity which is doing things like evaluating recent sensory experience, trying to predict future sensory experience, trying to do things like figure out appropriate goals, right? There's all this sort of internal processing that's going on. And I think most of that is not reflected in my model or my brain, which is the model version of my brain. Hopefully my brain is doing the same thing as all those other brains that we see images of, and is, you know, doing things like figuring out what sensory experience I had and what my goals should be next and all that kind of stuff.
Yes. This is probably a little far-fetched, but do you believe that, in a sense, eventually a model like this would be able to model cognition, self-consciousness or consciousness?
Yes. Would you like me to say more? Yeah, oh, okay. More than yes. See, I tried to give a short no. So, right, yeah, I mean, this is, you know, it's a good question, but in essence, I think the question you're asking me is, am I a physicalist, right? Which means, do I think that if we get all the physical properties of the model, or like if they're sufficiently similar to the physical properties in the brain that are important for that particular function, so in the case of self-awareness or consciousness, would that property then be in my model? And my suspicion is yes, right? Because it's not clear to me for every other case where we've tried to, you know, build a model of something, and if we get the sufficient number of properties, right, we seem to exhibit that property, right? So that seems to be the case for things like simple vision models and simple motor control models and simple all these other models. It's not clear to me why there would be a difference in kind for the ability to do things like report sensory experience, right? Which seems to me to be all the evidence we have for what consciousness in other individuals or beings is like. And in fact, it's very difficult to get access to animal conscious experience, right? And nevertheless, most people take it to be the case that that animals are conscious. And I think it's precisely because of all the different behaviors that they exhibit and the sophistication of the behaviors they exhibit. And I see no reason why that same sophistication and behavior wouldn't come out of a sufficiently complicated way in the future model, like you imagined. Yeah.
How many kinds of functional neuron synapse combinations does your model use?
How many kinds of
neuron synapse combinations does your model use?
So neuron synapse combinations? So do you mean, I'm not quite sure what you mean. So, there are 4 different kinds of synapses, right? So we have 4 different kinds of neurotransmitters in the model. So that's sort of part of your question? Okay, yeah. And then the other part is like how many different kinds of neurons are there? So there are basically, let me just count quickly. I think there are, yeah, well, it depends how you count, actually. So, you know, there's probably on the order of 6 or 7 different classes of physiological cells that are in there. Yeah, out of the hundreds of each of those, right? So, it's also very simplified in that way. A lot of the sort of specialized cells that you find typically show up actually in some of the like the brainstem and parts of the brain that we actually have not done a very good job of modeling in this particular case.
Thanks. First of all, thank you for your great presentation about your research. My question picks up a point that you brought up earlier in your presentation, which was about the brain evolving by evolution. And I would like to know if there are also currently some approaches where it is tried to model a brain from a much simpler model that basically evolves itself by the principles of evolution, more or less.
Right. So there are definitely lots of models. Well, I mean, there's an entire field of research called artificial life, right, where they build agent models that they then do things, you know, they give them a little genome, and then based on the performance of that genome, so that genome determines their behavior in some way, and then based on the performance, they'll, you know, cross the genes and try to eventually apply some kind of pressure to get a more functional organism coming at the other end, artificial organism. I've seen that done with neural networks, so as a way of sort of designing neural networks, but they tend to be very, very small, like on the order of 10 to 20 neurons. I don't know, so there's definitely, I should never say definitely, I don't know of any large-scale models that attempt to use that kind of approach for designing the large-scale models. And even at the small scale, I haven't seen it done a whole lot of times, and I think it's because it gets very, very slow as soon as you have 1,000 neurons, and you have now you've got connections between every possible neuron, so and you have to evolve all of them, and they often just don't do anything interesting at all, so it's very hard to evaluate whether that was a good organism or a bad organism, and so on. So yeah, I haven't actually seen that approach taken at a very large scale.
Okay, let's do one last question. Well, two last questions, one over there and one in the back.
My fellow students here and me, we recently took a course called Philosophy of Psychology, and we were talking a lot about reductionism and basically about the question if every phenomenon or all phenomena, including cognition and so on, can be reduced to physics in the end. And at least our lecturer in the end concluded, no, it can't. And he was giving examples like some psychiatric disorders, for instance, are also influenced by like social norms and so on. Since you're building brains and doing this like kind of on a physical basis, my question now is, do you believe in something like, okay, there's not just the physical level, cognition is also influenced by something else as physics, and if so, can you model it?
Right. Yeah, so this is a debate in which you have to be very careful to specify your terms, define your terms. And actually in my book I have a discussion of levels, precisely because I think a lot of people get confused about what it means to give an explanation at a particular level. And so I'm happy to, so in the sort of extreme philosophical case, if somebody says, could you model any psychiatric disease as being the result of physics, or do you think that's the case? I would say, yes, I think that's the case. But I also probably don't think that that would be a useful explanation by any means, right? So typically I think when people ask questions like, could you ever model schizophrenia, let's say, by looking at the physics of the disease, what they're really asking is, when I ask you for an explanation of why schizophrenia happens, do you think that giving me a complete physical description is going to be useful to me? And there I think the answer is no. And the reason the answer is no is because that physical description would be so complicated precisely because it would have to include things like social interactions, right, and interactions with your environment, which is also really complicated, right? So if you're trying to model something, you'd never want to be modeling every aspect of the physical world and then every aspect of every other social being in the world, and then the interactions with this particular brain that you're interested in, right? So I think it's just not the right kind of description to give to somebody in order to give them an explanation of the disease, a complete explanation of the disease. Now, there are definitely aspects of something like schizophrenia which clearly are physically based, right? And so we can look at, how are the brains of schizophrenics different from the brains of non-schizophrenics, what are the sort of wiring differences we can look at the level of individual neurons. But really a complete understanding or useful understanding of schizophrenia is going to be able to relate that kind of understanding to an understanding which also talks about things like social norms and the environment and sort of parenting, interactions, all kinds of stuff. And you can include those sorts of impacts on your model, right? So you can put in social interactions. You can say, this person influences this person by giving them such and such information, and you can include those influences in your model, but you probably wouldn't do it in a way that had you simulating the neurons in every single brain of every single agent that was interacting. So hopefully that answers your question. So in response to your speaker, I would say, you actually haven't shown or given any reasons why I couldn't physically model everything and eventually build a system in which we saw schizophrenia show up and had it change in the same way that it does in a real schizophrenic. But that's a completely useless thing for me to do, right? If you're talking about explanation, then yeah, there's a level of explanation that's going to be useful for the questions you're asking. And what we really want to do in science is make our explanations line up with the level of the question that's being asked, right? So in the case of some of these psychological phenomena I showed, people might not want to know what all the neurons are doing, right? They might want to just have a model that reproduces the error rates because they want to go and do something with that model that depends on error rates. And for that, you might not have to have any neurons at all. Right? So I think it's really an issue of getting explanations aligned with questions more than it is an issue of, what's the right level, or, are there levels that you can't reduce or you can reduce? I think those are essentially sort of misguided in a way.
Thank you very much.
Hello. First, thank you for your talk.
Thanks.
Well, in simple neural networks, often there's the issue of destructive forgetting. How does SPAN handle this problem?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the constructive.
The issue of destructive forgetting. So if a simple neural network is trained to drive on a road to make many turns,
right?
And then it has the task to drive on a straight road for a long time.
Right.
It forgets how to make a turn.
Yes. So, yeah, there's a long answer which I probably won't give, and it's getting late. I want to go get a beer or something. And there's the short answer, which I will give. So the short answer is that essentially SPAN doesn't have a long-term memory that we're training anything into. So we just essentially avoid the problem by not having a system which we're trying to put a lot of information over and over and over again. The only place where we really do that is in the reinforcement learning task. And there, it maps onto the data really well, right? So basically, the reinforcement learning part of the model forgets in the same way that animals actually seem to forget, with the same sort of time constant. So we're happy with that part of the model. But in a way, I think the real answer to your question is it's just not in the model, essentially.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for this
thank you.
Great talk. So I hope we have all learned a lot about the brain. So, and next week there will be another talk, but then Rolf Pfeiffer will talk about robotics. So that's not a whole different area, because you've done robotics as well.
That's right, yeah. We're now putting our brains into robots.
So I hope to see most of you back, or all of you back next week, hopefully in another exciting lecture. So thank you again.
Thanks.
Embedded in the model, so you can actually interact with it appropriately.
across synaptic clefts. They're referred to as the time constant associated with neurotransmitters in the area. Doing something like controlling the arm, which has weird mass or weird dynamics, like nonlinear muscle models and those kinds of stuff. And you can only do that if you take the dynamics of that system into account when you're generating a control signal for it in some way. So I think basically to the extent that we've got the behaviors that we do, we have dynamical versions of those behaviors. But I would completely take the point that we don't have all behaviors in the parts. We don't have dynamics. Does that make sense? Like, so basically, I think we've got dynamics to the extent we can. Sure, that's true. It's not one I share.